Truman Show isn't a big visual effects show as, say, a contemporary visual effects show that has big sequences in them. The visual effects are really there to support the story. And it was about these characters, and that's what's so engaging about it is these characters and, you know, wanting freedom and all these kinds of great ideas of, like, getting to talk to God. I mean, there's amazing concepts all kind of interwoven in this story. And so our role was to add value to that arena, to help set that stage so that the story could be told.
Well, there's a whole effort in visual effects to make things photorealistic. And for the Truman Show, we sort of started from the concept that it was going to be photorealistic and that they were going to be credible images. But then, because of it being such an unusual world, there was a hyper-reality that Peter was really after. And it's, you know, evident in the production design and the cinematography and the costuming. Everything's too colorful, there's too much light everywhere. Everything's too perfect.
It was a great story, the concept that the Truman character would be in this synthetic created world, and it would be an art-directed world. It wouldn't be completely realistic. It would be as if somebody designed it. And that idea had to come across in the visuals that we created for the film. So it was very challenging for us to achieve that, because on one hand, we're always trying to make our work look undetectable as an illusion, and on the other hand, the story wanted us to make something that looked a little bit heightened, a little stylized.
Hyper-real in terms of the Truman Show would mean things like too much fill light, the color palette being too beautiful, too pastel, too perfect, the color of the ocean off the coast being this strange blue that would only happen at sunrise and sunset in that little town. It would mean that when we had a wide shot looking out to sea, we would arbitrarily chop off the last 5 miles of horizon so it looked like the sea was only a mile away.
We looked at postcards from the 1950s that sort of showed like views of Los Angeles or views of New York or Florida, and they would put these big moons in the sky and make them sort of large and green. And then the light on the water would be like a different color. It wouldn't make any sense. It kind of looked bad, but interesting. And that was sort of a tone that we set for the film, which was to sort of create these images that looked as if there was a whole art department for this television show that was deciding what the night would look like, what the sunrise would look like, all the different phenomena visually that would be designed and slightly man-made.
When you were hauling chickens in the summer for Kaiser, what was the furthest you ever got off the island?
Went all over. Never found a place like this, though. Look at that sunset, Truman. It's perfect.
We did an aerial shot of the Sea Haven area, and Mike McAllister shot a helicopter plate flying by the town, sort of dusk-like. It was very ambient lighting, had a little bit of warmth on it from the setting sun. And to that, we went in and then changed that environment by adding story points that would be in the film. For example, we had a river inlet that we added, and there was a bridge on that. If you remember, that's a story point where he can't cross the bridge, so we had to put that bridge in the master shot. Also, if you photograph a scene normally, the horizon is flat, it's straight. It goes from left to right across the camera frame. We curved that, we bended it down a little bit so that it suggested that maybe this area was sort of in a smaller place than the real world, like a little domed city. And then the clouds also looked a little distorted. They moved on the inside surface of a dome. These were subtle things. These are things that you'd have to really kind of look at to get, but they're there as sort of foretelling of the basic realization that he is in this giant soundstage.
Well, for the most part, the visual effects in Truman Show were, they were quite straightforward and simple. There are a few occasions when they actually were more recognizable as visual effects. We did some set extensions, some building extensions, because it was clear that what was there in Seaside, Florida, wasn't what the movie needed. They wanted 4-story buildings. And rather than build them, it became a lot easier and a lot more cost-effective to just build the bottom floor, the first story, so that everything didn't become a visual effect. And then using some CG techniques, Matt World was able to add the subsequent floors to the buildings.
The production had made the first story of the downtown buildings. Dennis Gassner designed what should be built practically at the Sea Haven location. Because Sea Haven had this great 200 buildings sort of homes, but it didn't have a big downtown section, so that had to be created as a story point for the film. So Dennis figured out what should be built as a set and then what we should finish off with computer graphics. And those shots were more realistic. That was not interpreted as something that would look surrealistic. That was something that had to look completely real.
We had a problem in the Truman Show of a building height code. We could only build 35 feet, and we had much bigger structures than that. And so luckily the computer was advanced enough at that point to extend the buildings and realize the concept of what we wanted.
Working with Dennis was really a unique experience at that time, and it is fairly traditional now to work that way. And what he did was he designed the downtown city on the computer using CAD, and then would decide what should be built as a set. So he would then give plans to the construction people to build, say, the first story of the buildings. And then we had those same plans that we would bring into our computer and start to texture, add more detail to for the computer graphics solution. But what was nice about that is we had exactly what the set people had, and we had a great copy of it, so we both were on the same page as far as what they built and what we finished off. And I think that is something now that I would actually like to see more of. I mean, in some cases we don't have that cooperation and that closeness, and it gets very expensive to fix things in a post-production process. So Dennis had it all figured out very well, and that was a unique thing to do at that time.
Coming to you now from Sea Haven Island, enclosed in the largest studio ever constructed.
Well, the pullback to the dome was the tour de force and by far the most difficult visual effects work in the movie.
The design of the dome was a particularly challenging part of, how would you house something like this that was a mile and a half high and 2.5 miles or 3 miles wide? I mean, it's an enormous structure. I did enough studying to try and come up with a particular set of design, which is a little bit almost based on the geodesic, kind of Bucky Fuller's kind of theory, but still more abstract than that.
And that was actually the first CG structure that I'd ever been involved in making. And so I learned a lot about what you can't do in CG, at least you couldn't do in CG at that time, which was basically light anything in any sort of paradigm that approached reality. Well, one of the big challenges of creating that dome was selling to the audience exactly how big it really is, because there is no structure on the planet that is as big as that. So the challenge was we sort of knew that the audience would only be able to comprehend a certain scale for it. So it was finding ways to make it, to sell that it's really as big as a city. A couple of ways of doing that were, of course, to start on the town, back up through a door. And one of the reasons that I got my little cameo in the movie is because we needed to have a human being in the shot just as a frame of reference as we're pulling away from the dome, so that when we get really, really far back there and this dome's covering acres and acres and acres of land, the audience maybe will remember how big a human was on one girder, really, really far away. And then getting it to set into the scene was quite difficult because it was so big in size that in terms of even simple things like aerial perspective, when you do composites, you might put a little haze over one layer so that it feels further away than the layer that's closer to camera. But on that dome, the dome was so big that it had layers of different densities of haze on the structure itself, so that the back of the structure would fit into the distant background and the front of the structure would fit into the middle ground of the background. It's quite challenging.
Well, the Truman Show came out at a time, or actually when we were working on it, at a time, it was an early digital show for us. And what that means is that a lot of the traditional tools for creating imagery and visual effects was being replaced by computer graphics and digital compositing. But that was still a fairly early period of time that we were relearning our tools, so to speak. And some of the original digital matte paintings that we did of, say, clouds and the environments tended to look a little too crisp, again, a little too realistic for the Truman Show. Because in the scenes in the film, for example, if he's out on the ocean and there's supposed to be a giant cloud backing, there's a lot of footage that they shot in a tank with an actual painted backing behind the boat and the water tank and the characters. So for us to go and do digital clouds or computer graphics clouds didn't quite fit right with those shots. So we ended up actually doing more traditional matte paintings and then compositing them digitally, or taking a painted cloud layer and wrapping it on the inside of a sphere so it looks sort of distorted, but it still looked like it was painted by hand.
The end sequence during the storm was all shot at Falls Lake, which is basically a backlot tank at Universal Studios. And they have a really big, huge cyclorama that you can paint, whatever you want to paint on it, and we painted clouds on it. But we weren't able to run the boat into that structure because, they didn't want us to break it. So the construction department built sort of an addition to that wall, mostly so that we could run the boat into it. And, the mast could poke through the wall. But even so, even with the addition to the backing that was there, when you got the camera back really far, we were still either shooting off the sides of the background, and if we weren't shooting off the sides of the background, a lot of times what would happen is the reflection in the water was of the sky above the cyclorama. So there was still visual effects work required to get rid of the unwanted reflections and put reflections in that we wanted. But there were several shots where we actually did have to extend the background, and we had to basically dump the reflections and put new reflections in that felt like the background that we'd added.
So it was an interesting amalgam of traditional tools and digital tools. We ended up doing more traditional painting work than I thought we were going to do on the show, because our mindset was to sort of get on with how to create things electronically with the computer. And sometimes that total realism, it was great for the realism that we wanted, but again, this show is more about something that was considered by an artist, something that was art directed, something that a team of people kind of figured out, well, let's make the moon bigger because that'll be more dramatic tonight. So that's the kind of look that we made for the film.